In the 1960s, Francis Ford Coppola was considered something of a maverick in the making. After enrolling in UCLA Film School, he did various works on films, including impressing the legendary film producer Roger Corman through bit work on B-movies. His UCLA thesis project would be a fully fledged feature-length film called You're a Big Boy Now, which gained critical acclaim and even picked up a theatrical release by Warner Brothers, which was practically unheard of for young film students at the time. He was then given the project Finian's Rainbow to direct, and as producer Jack Warner was turned off by Coppola's shaggy-haired hippie look, he left the young man to his own devices on the movie, and what resulted was another critical success. His next project, The Rain People, went over budget and the studio had to step in and finish the movie. At this time, Coppola was young, idealistic and ambitious, wanting to subvert the studio system which he felt was stifling his cinematic vision. He also toured Europe, which introduced him to alternate filmmaking techniques. As such, he launched his own production company, American Zoetrope, intended to be an unconventional rebel studio which would produce mainstream pictures to finance offbeat auteur projects and give first-time directors a chance to prove themselves. There was just one problem. Coppola's studio became heavily in debt. The Zoetrope-produced, George Lucas-directed THX 1138, for example, was so unappealing to Warner Brothers, who had backed it, that they demanded their money back, compounding Coppola's problems and sending American Zoetrope and Coppola's dreams to the brink of collapse. It is this Francis Ford Coppola who received a phone call from Paramount Pictures wanting him to direct an adaptation of the Mario Puzo bestseller The Godfather, after it had been turned down by big names like Sergio Leone, Peter Bogdanovich and Arthur Penn. To accept this offer from a mainstream studio and produce a crowd pleaser for the masses went against Coppola's principles that he had set out for himself and American Zoetrope, so he turned the offer down. Plus, he wasn't impressed with Puzo's novel, calling it a potboiler which Puzo wrote to make some cash. But George Lucas managed to convince Coppola to take on the project, imploring him that the company needs the money. The rest, as they say, is history. But I think it's important to be aware of this groundwork when discussing Francis Ford Coppola and The Godfather, as it makes some of his later statements make more sense. This is the man who directed two of the greatest gangster films of all time. He practically invented the modern mafia movie, and yet has gone on record saying he isn't interested in the mafia. He isn't interested in The Sopranos. He didn't want to make The Godfather. He tried to get out of making The Godfather Part 2. He openly admits to making The Godfather 3 for the money. Regarding his indifferent and uninterested attitude towards crime films, it can come off as pretentious and self-righteous, with him being the man who gave us arguably the best gangster film ever made and subsequently distancing himself from it. Is he trying to say, "Oh, I'm so good I didn't even want to make this film and it still ended up a masterpiece"? Is he a snob who's trying to be a controversial contrarian? No, he isn't. I think he's being very sincere when he says he isn't interested in the mafia genre, when he says things like he felt trapped by the success of the Godfather films. Think about it from his perspective. The Godfather is essentially a paycheck, a chance for him to save American Zoetrope, and it ends up becoming the thing he's most and forever will be known for. These recent weird movies he's been making, Megalopolis, Youth Without Youth and Twixt, are actually the kinds of films he wants to make, for better or worse. And what's worse for Coppola is the studio coming to him demanding a sequel. And this is after he had a horrible time directing the first film, with the studio being underwhelmed by his artistic choices and he being on the brink of being fired. It wasn't as common back then for films to get sequels like they do now. I remember Coppola saying he found the idea absurd, saying something like the only way you can make a sequel is if you make something like Abbott and Costello Meet the Godfather. He had a bad experience making the first one and didn't want to be in that environment again, saying, "I didn't get along with Bob Evans during The Godfather at all. He was so tough on me. I was seriously on the verge of getting fired maybe on 3 or 4 occasions. When The Godfather fooled everyone and was this colossal success, they came to me and said, 'Of course we want to make Michael Corleone Returns, because it made money.' I said I didn't want to have anything to do with Paramount Pictures or Bob Evans. I didn't want to have anything to do with gangsters. I could say that because now I had a couple of bucks." He did initially agree to pen the script to the sequel, so long as someone else would direct it, but in the end he did direct it, this time with much more freedom than he had the last time around, which involved getting rid of producer Bob Evans. And unbelievably, the lightning in the bottle effect hits again, and Coppola is 2 for 2. And he even squeezed in the conversation in between the two Godfather films. One of the most fascinating pieces of trivia from mafia cinema is that when Coppola was approached by the studio to make The Godfather Part 2, he turned it down and actually recommended a young up-and-coming filmmaker named Martin Scorsese. That's fascinating, isn't it? The idea that Scorsese had the opportunity to make the second Godfather film. The first would have been done by Francis Ford Coppola, the second by Martin Scorsese. And Coppola clearly had a good eye, as Scorsese would go on to not just make good gangster movies, but to revolutionize the genre 18 years later after The Godfather Part 2 with his film Goodfellas, and inspire an entire new generation of filmmakers and crime movies, just like The Godfather did. Incidentally, Goodfellas came out the same year as The Godfather Part 3 and completely blew it out of the water as the year's big mafia film. He also went on to make the modern crime classic Casino, the epic Gangs of New York, the Oscar-winning The Departed, and even a meta-commentary on the crime genre of sorts, a swan song, a curtain closer, The Irishman, with many actors known for gangster movies joining the project. It isn't a stretch to call Marty the greatest gangster movie director of all time. However, the Martin Scorsese who was offered The Godfather Part 2 was not the Marty who made Goodfellas, as The Godfather Part 2 was released in 1974, so the highest profile film Scorsese had under his belt at that point was a mafia movie of his own, Mean Streets, regarded by many as the movie that put Scorsese on the map. And even then, Mean Streets was released in 1973, so I'm not sure the film was even completed when Coppola suggested Scorsese to the studio. But some reports I've seen suggest that Mean Streets was completed by the time Scorsese was put forward by Coppola, and many studios had actually seen the film. Expectedly, the studio balked at Coppola's idea, given Scorsese's lack of experience. Sure, there was evidence of Scorsese's skill in his work up until then, but his work consisted of low-budget flicks like the Roger Corman crime drama Boxcar Bertha, not sweeping huge epics with Hollywood A-listers. I think we can all agree that the studio was well within their right to turn down Scorsese for their hottest property. And of course, The Godfather Part 2 ended up being an amazing film. Yes, they took a risk on Coppola too, but Coppola had far more pedigree than Scorsese when he was hired for the first one. Don't forget, he was even an Oscar winner, as his screenplay for the biopic Patton won an Academy Award. Plus, Scorsese was a few years younger than Coppola, still in his 20s at the time. It looks like Scorsese has no regrets at being turned down. In fact, he agrees that he wasn't ready, saying, "He told me, and honestly, I don't think I could have made a film on that level at that time in my life, and who I was at that time. To make a film as elegant and masterful and as historically important as Godfather II, I don't think. Now, I would have made something interesting, but his maturity was already there. I still had this kind of edgy thing, the wild kid running around." I think that sums it up quite well. Mean Streets certainly has a gritty quality to it, focusing on low-level mob hoods, utilizing things like a handheld shaky camera to evoke a rough feeling, a far cry from the grand operatic epic Coppola constructed. Even back then, Scorsese's camera was up close and personal, whipping back and forth frantically, whereas Coppola has a more sedentary approach with the camera usually way far back. I've always wondered what a Scorsese-directed Godfather Part 2 would look like. Of course, so many variables could be different. Heck, maybe Al Pacino refuses to do the movie because Paramount have bought in this no-name on the cheap. It's also worth mentioning that the Michael Corleone storyline in the second movie isn't in the book. So no Frank Pentangeli, no Michael killing Fredo, no Michael and Kay splitting up, no Hyman Roth, none of that. And if Scorsese had some significant creative control, unlikely I know, but he might demand script changes to change the focus of the film. Certainly, Scorsese regularly has themes of Catholic guilt and redemption in his films, and that could synergize well with the Godfather sequel, where a Michael Corleone is fully ingrained into his role as a mafia boss and is looking to go legitimate. The template is there for a great Scorsese film. I mean, Scorsese's subsequent career proved he is incredibly versatile stylistically, and he is capable of making the kinds of grand sweeping epic that the Godfather films are. The Age of Innocence comes to mind, for example. But it's clear where he is most comfortable, and it's not in the world of white-collar crime, of international crime syndicates, of political upheavals in Cuba and whatnot. As he said, I was more street level. What I saw around me wasn't guys in a boardroom or sitting around a big table talking. That took another artistic level that Francis had at that point. He didn't come from that world, the world I came from. And it's clear from the gangster films he made like Goodfellas, where the mafia is shown from a different angle, where they are shown like violent, treacherous thugs who live paranoid, drug-fueled and unfulfilling, dangerous lives. In some ways you could argue that Scorsese tore down the image of the gangster that Coppola put up in the first place. There is an interview that Scorsese did in the 90s that suggests that had he taken the job, we wouldn't actually follow the rise and fall of Michael Corleone. But instead, there might have been an increased focus on Frank Pentangeli, the man who Michael leaves in charge of the old Corleone family while he moves to Nevada. It makes sense, as that would have kept the focus on the streets. In fact, there's a line from Frank in the film that perfectly encapsulates the difference between Coppola and Scorsese. I know I'll never have your kind of brains in big deals, but Mike, this is a street thing. Scorsese had said, I find Frank Pentangeli, the character played by Michael V. Gazzo, so special in The Godfather Part II. The way he carries himself, his tone, his language, reveals something ancient, someone who knows the old world and sadly witnesses how it has changed. No one knows how to play the Tangarella anymore, he complains. His brother's mere presence at the congressional hearings is enough to have him recant as a government witness. It is the old world, with its old, unmovable values, that has suddenly reappeared to remind him of an atavistic code of honor. Of course, Scorsese saying this doesn't mean he would have based the entire film around Pentangeli, but he clearly had an affinity for the character, and he could have done something with Pentangeli as the New York Corleone street boss, watching the world change and evolve around him. After The Godfather Part II, Coppola would swap fedoras with Huey helicopters and disappear into the maddening jungle to make Apocalypse Now. Scorsese, on the other hand, would make pictures even more dirty and grim, making the raw and disturbing Taxi Driver, which cemented the director's place in cinematic history. Elsewhere, Scorsese has heaped praise on The Godfather II, calling it Coppola's best film, saying, constructed like a symphony and directed by a master as a great conductor directs his orchestra, it reaches its highest point of lyricism for me in The Godfather Part II, my favourite of Francis Ford Coppola's pictures. All in all, I think things turned out for the best. Coppola gave us one of the greatest films ever made. Scorsese was too inexperienced at the time and had a very different boots-on-the-floor style approach to organised crime that doesn't really fit with the tone the Godfather films had. Had he made the movie and it been a disaster, it may have killed his career. He's a good director when he takes someone else's project and directs it, like the only sequel he ever made, The Colour of Money, but he's an amazing director when he makes his own projects. Can you imagine Michael Corleone taking out the heads of the 5 families, with Gimme Shelter being pumped out at full volume while Ray Liotta narrates the whole movie and Fredo shoots up heroin in Cuba? So what do you think a Scorsese-directed Godfather Part 2 would look like? Let me know in the comments section below, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.